Welcome to Philosophy15. I'm Robert Talisse. This is my colleague and friend and philosophical partner.
Partner in crime, man. I'm Scott Aikin, and we are the co-authors of Why We Argue and How We Should, a guide to political disagreement.
And as you know, this is a series where we're just speaking freely, thinking freely even, about philosophy. We are not going to bother now with any long descriptions about what we're doing here because we are in the thick of a deep set of problems that have to do with skepticism about democracy of a very particular kind now.
Right.
Because what we are, where we're landing now is we are seeing within democratic theory analogs of worries from epistemology with skepticism, right? So we're not just being skeptic, we're not just coming across skepticism about democracy like, oh, is democracy any good? We're now seeing the political analogs of pretty standard skeptical worries within epistemology. So 2 episodes ago, we were worried about the problem of the criterion, long-standing epistemological worry about knowledge and justification in its guise within political philosophy, particularly within democratic theory. So here's the worry that we left with last time. Let me just state it and then let's get up and running again. We're worried that if we think that democracy is centrally about argumentation, proper argumentation is going to be both too demanding. It's going to require a lot of virtue on the part of citizens. That's an old sort of Platonic worry. It's an Aristotelian worry. It's a worry in the Federalist. There's all kinds of places where you get the worry that whatever good democratic citizenship is, or democracy requires good citizens. Whatever it takes to be a good citizen is going to be too much for the average guy.
Right. And so you have to have democracies that set it up so that structurally you prevent those things. So, for example, the Federalist Papers, the thing to manage is factionalism.
Good. But this
is a different worry.
This is a different worry. This is a conceptual problem. And it runs like this. Whatever the epistemic demands are for good citizens, for good citizenship in a democracy, it requires that democratic citizens are good argumentatively. How do they get good argumentatively? We've got reason now to think, given the way that dialectical pathologies work, we have good reason to think that the way to not get good argumentatively, or you can't get good argumentatively by watching argumentation being performed by purported informed people.
And the reason why is that if you think that you're going to be educated about the issues by folks who are performing argumentation for political purposes, right? And again, this is, you might say, for the most part, they're often under certain kinds of conditions where they're not going to be able to address all the issues. They're going to be able to need to make things more palatable, more accessible. And so as a consequence, they're not going to be educating you. They're just going to be out to be able to get an idea out and then win the argument. So this is ripe, you might say, ripe for many what we call dialectical fallacies. Straw man arguments, begging the question, certain kinds of slippery slope arguments. Because why? Often you have to leave many of the facts out, and it turns out that those arguments are actually very effective on you might say, audiences that are not particularly well informed.
Well, that all seems right. Let's make one further complicating point. In political argument, given the nature of democracy, right? In political argument, the comparative stuff, the making your position look better than the most present competitor, is what success is. And that's different. That's different from in sort of in other kinds of argumentative contexts where you're trying to elicit rational dissent by showing that, in a non-comparative way, the reasons that support your conclusion, right, are robust enough or are forceful enough or have the favoring capacity to the degree that would elicit rational acceptance. In political argument, You're arguing P, I'm arguing not P. The default is I just have to show not P is better.
Just a hair better, and even just a hair better.
Right. It doesn't have to. It doesn't even.
And it has to just be better than your version.
This
right.
exactly right. So the once the conditions for argumentative success get that particularist, it's about my particular interlocutor, and comparative, it's about being better than that guy. The occasion, the opportunity for pathology.
It's almost too overwhelming.
Saturated.
It's too overwhelming.
It's saturated.
So let's kind of take a step back. We're able to see why the pathologies are so prevalent, and we have a relatively robust vocabulary for the pathologies. We've got a proposed solution to it, but it looks like the solution's got this problem. So we recognize where things lie, but now the issue is this such a problem for democracy uniquely? So, for example, if we just say, look, what's the justification for democracy? Could the justification for democracy just be, it just outperforms, it does badly. Why? Because we're bad at argument. But the thought is, if we had the case where we said, okay, well, look, is it going to do better than any kinds of oligarchies, or is it going to do better than a kind of a tyranny? And the thought is that, look, in any of the cases where you're going to have one individual or smaller groups of individuals making the decisions, it looks like these pathologies are going to be there too. So if you might say, if knowledge is going to be a criterion for political legitimacy, then it looks like all the problems that come along with being able to identify knowledge is going to be the case for any instance of anyone exercising political authority. So it looks like you'd say something like, even if you had Plato's philosopher kings, right, and they had to get together and deliberate, if the problems that we're positing right now, again, we'll hold in abeyance whether or not Plato's right about whether or not we can recollect things and things like that. But if we even just said, but if the problem with the criterion's the case, right, we can't distinguish between, you only know that recollection is a criterion for truth only if you know that the things that you know on recollection are true, right? You can just have recollections. He's like, all the things that I recollect are false, as it turns out, right? Yeah, you just recollected that, right? That's kind of like saying you just dreamed that. You can imagine someone saying that, right? Yeah. And so maybe the thought is not to play for a win, but to play for not losing, right?
Okay, good.
To avoid being not just last place, but to be the best of the worst.
Okay.
So
let me sort of say two things in response. One is just to flag a discussion that we have to have a subsequent episode on.
Yes.
Because there is, I think, and I don't know whether we might disagree on this. I think that there is an important distinction to be made between epistemic authority and political authority.
Yes.
And so when you said knowledge is sort of a requirement or is a condition for political legitimacy, that sounds to me like a category
error
problem.
Right. Sure.
And I don't think democratic theorists do well to tie political legitimacy to epistemic authority so tightly.
So again, we can weaken that. We can even just say whatever epistemic success is a criterion for legitimacy.
Maybe not. Okay. So we need to
we'll have
do
another
something
discussion
on what
that'll be a real
that
argument.
Is. That's one thing. The second thing, though, okay, so good. Let's play the comparative game. Okay, deliberative democracy, is it gonna fare at least as well as, because we haven't even touched any of the moral concerns that might tip the scale in democracy's favor against an epistemically against an epistemically equally well or maybe even slightly better performing non-democratic alternative.
Right.
So there's that kind of stuff too, right? Okay. Right. But let's just stick on the epistemic stuff. Maybe democracy just has to be at least as good epistemically as some benevolent forms of oligarchy or monarchy or something. Good. All that seems correct. And you might even say part of that assessment, comparative assessment between deliberative democracy and non-deliberative, non-democratic alternatives, also has to do with assessments of the stability and what devolving benevolent monarchies devolve into versus what devolving not fully rational, reasonable democracies devolve into.
Okay, so those are three conditions.
Those are all good things to talk about.
Yep.
But I think that one comparative question that still remains is, which version of democracy should we be committing to?
Yeah.
So it looks to me like once we're saying like, well, will this badly functioning from the deliberative point of view, deliberative democracy outperform a badly functioning Platonic oligarchy? Okay, yeah, maybe it's preferable. But why think that any deliberative, any epistemic option is preferable to just a democratic politics that says roughly a kind of what sometimes is called democratic elitism or sometimes called realism, the Joseph Schumpeter view for the people who are following along, that just says democracy is pulling a lever and then divesting yourself of your political opinions for 4 years. Democracy is about the stable succession of rulers. On election day, we pick the next group of people to rule within constitutional constraints for a limited period of time, and the good democratic citizen pulls the lever on the basis of whatever information it seems worthwhile for him to try to gather, if any, and then gets out, stops, Schumpeter called backseat, stop backseat driving, stop having political opinions. Now this is we might say, maybe that's better.
Right.
Epistemically.
And maybe even better for you emotionally. Yeah. You can think of all the reasons why people who have
certainly better for me emotionally.
Right. You're like, I'm not going to pay attention to politics anymore because it upsets me so much, right? I can't change. Me paying attention to it obviously doesn't change it. I was really informed about that last vote, and things still didn't go my way. And so you can imagine someone thinking, you might say, just as a bit of self-care, the Schumpeter model is a good one.
And it might be better just
so long as you have a place to go to be safe from the politics.
Well, this is the thing. So it might even be better from the moral point of view. Like you can be nicer to your neighbors when nobody around you has political opinions.
Man, I tell you, Thanksgiving just got a lot more pleasant.
Now, we are living in a society. This is just another. I hate to say that this is turning into a series of sort of anti-democratic stuff, but.
And skeptical stuff. That's what I was giving the thumbs up for. Anti-democrat.
Yeah, we don't want the conclusion, but let's try to make it as hard as we can. Eventually, we'll start trotting out the arguments in favor of the democracy stuff. But
you hope.
Well, yeah, I hope the arguments wind up still being good. So we're living in a political context that is saturated with prompts. Not mere prompts, but commands. Yeah. Not mere commands, but inducements. For everybody to have a political opinion about everything that happens. Everything.
Right.
We are constantly being told you have to have a thought about this. You have to formulate an opinion. Formulate an opinion as quickly as possible. Formulate an opinion and get on social media and find others who are going to shout it louder than you as quickly as possible. And that model, that series of inducements to form political opinions and espouse them as quickly as possible is often presented as a sort of paradigm of good democratic citizenship. It might actually be a pathology.
Well, so I think that there's certainly something that is pathological about, that could be seen as pathological about it. That's not just merely epistemic, or maybe is epistemic in another sense, is that so much of the way that the social media element of politics is that on the one hand, because it's generally not in terms of being happy about something, it's about being upset about something, about finding something to be outraged about, and expressing one's righteous indignation in a way that at the very least you're able to be seen. Right? It's not just having the outrage, it's the being seen having the outrage that somehow gives you a kind of an authority. Right?
Yeah.
There's a kind of halo that seems to be around the head of those who have the right kind of attitudes that then they say, I'm now aggrieved by this.
Right. Like the Keith Olbermann, where he would go and face the camera. This is a couple years back, right, with the Bush president, face the camera and just
furrow his brow,
unleash righteous indignation, and to the people who are on his side, it was like catnip for cats, and the people who aren't on his side, it was totally offensive and ridiculous.
And it looks just like emoting.
Yeah.
And the last point is that this happened with the Trump presidential campaign, that so many people were getting all sorts of time by what? By having a tirade about Trump. So again, it's good to have opinions. We think maybe, but
maybe
another skeptical trope, and that you might call it's mostly bullshit.
Right, and that the rational thing to do, and maybe the moral thing to do, is to suspend judgment as often as possible. Philosophy 15, folks. Thank you.